They passed the note under the table like contraband. In dim lamplight, a folded scrap of paper traveled from hand to hand, while laughter filled the banquet hall, and the band played tunes meant to drown unease. It was October of 1944 in the fortified capital, and the regime still staged spectacle as if the march of armies could be sealed from sight. Publicly, the voice from the balcony promised victory. Yet in secure rooms, maps bled red and black, supply trains were late, and a handful of men with badges and titles read reports that said the war was already lost. This is the story of how a circle of power tried to turn defeat into myth, of the memos they burned, the excuses they rehearsed, and the small, stubborn acts of a logistics officer who refused to let illusion hide the truth. We will follow his notebooks, eavesdrop on conversations in smoke-filled corridors, sit in a freezing railway yard where coal ran out, and try to understand why truth was folded into a napkin and tossed aside when nations would pay the price. Colonel Friedrich Adler will stand as our anchor, a former engineer turned chief of supply reports, a man who watched the arithmetic of failure add up while men with medals kept writing speeches. At first, the narrative is a crest of confidence. In the spring before the shortages became obvious, convoys still moved with a rhythm, radios crackled with optimistic coordinates, and the press printed maps of expansion with thick black lines. Celebrations were held in municipal halls, generals posed for photographs, and engineers showed models of new tanks as if production could be increased overnight. The capital buzzed with proclamations from Adolf Hitler and with ministry memoranda that insisted on the final push. In those months, figures mattered more than fact. Wilhelm Keitel stood before a table of officers and pronounced a timetable. Albert Speer later described the mood of makeshift workshops where workers labored under floodlights like priests of an industry gone fervent. For a time, the machinery of state appeared decisive, a complex organism fueled by ideology and industry, and many believed the story they were told. Sensory details anchor the memory of that confidence. The smell of machine oil in production halls, the metallic taste of coffee drunk at midnight by clerks, the tactile weight of maps spread across oak tables, the distant thunder of artillery rehearsals that was meant to be intimidation, and the bright glare of searchlights over the city that turned night into false day. Yet even then, small reports sat unread on desks. Friedrich Adler noted in a penciled margin that fuel consumption had outpaced delivery by 30%, and that the rail nodes were suffering so many delays that units were stranded without food or ammunition. He wrote the numbers in a ledger that would later act as an indictment. The first fissures arrived not with a single explosion, but as a battery of unnoticed failures. Convoys stalled in mud, telegraph lines went dead more often, and requisitions for trucks returned with bureaucratic delays. On a cold morning in November, Adler intercepted a coded cable from Army Group North that spoke of encirclement and asked for fuel that the depot could not spare. He carried that cable into a room where General Oberst Hoth, Minister Speer, and Chief of Staff Wilhelm Keitel argued under the portrait of a leader smiling in oil paint. The conversation is recorded in troves of memoranda and in the whispered exchanges that followed. Dialogue expanded into insistence as facts crashed against narrative. Keitel said the lines would be reinforced. Speer promised increased production. Hoth asked for permission to withdraw. Adler replied with numbers. The exchanges between these men stretched and strained the logic of command. At one point, Keitel said, "We can maintain the front." Hoth answered, "We cannot hold what we cannot feed." Speer interjected, "We can reroute resources." Adler insisted that trains were already overbooked and rails sabotaged. In that room, the sensory world tightened. The rasp of a cigar, the metallic clink of a teacup set, the dampness of the heated room on a wet coat, the bitter smell of tobacco, the thin taste of anxiety that lingered on speech. These were not grand admissions, yet they formed the first concrete evidence that the surface triumph hid a rotten underpinning. Voices became a chorus of denial.
Men with names and responsibilities smiled into microphones while their supply base shrank. One of the first candid documents arrived on a morning train that never reached its destination. A convoy coming from the eastern depots stopped short after a bridge collapse, and the reports contained raw numbers. They named towns and rail stations and listed trucks abandoned in mud and soldiers thinning out of rations. That report reached Friedrich Adler through a second-hand channel, and he took it to his superior, General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt. They read it together by lamplight. The conversation that followed was an effort of 6 to 8 exchanges that turned from procedural to accusatory. Von Rundstedt asked who had authorized the reroute. Adler answered Logistics Command. The general demanded a plan. Adler replied with a ledger. The general said, "Proceed anyway." Adler said, "There is no proceeding without fuel." The general sighed and said, "Orders are orders." Adler asked who would carry responsibility when cities burned. The general answered that responsibility rested with command. Each line contained the rough textures of anxiety, the scratch of pen on paper, the chill of draft from an open window, the faint odor of cold iron wafting from the stove, the acrid tang of fear swallowed in silence, and the weight of shoulders leaning toward the map. Those exchanges were the first to show that even when officers privately acknowledged danger, they felt constrained by protocol and by the performance of unity. The fissure widened when an intercepted memo revealed that members of the inner circle had begun to alter casualty
reports and to delay the transmission of supply figures to the radio networks. Names became crucial. Joseph Goebbels insisted on narrative cohesion. Martin Bormann counseled secrecy. Heinrich Himmler fretted about morale in the camps and the need to avoid panic. The list of characters grew, and each carried an action that moved from concealment to manipulation. At that point, we asked the audience to pause and engage. If you were watching from the outside, which single decision do you think was the true point of no return? Start your comment with point X and name the decision, the date, and why you think it mattered. Your input helps shape future episodes where we parse the margins between political theater and military reality. The voices of viewers often bring archival documents to light and point to testimonies historians may have overlooked. Now we return to the ledger and to the men who tried to hide the arithmetic of collapse. The collapse assembled itself in battles that will be familiar yet remain shocking in micro detail. There were sieges where commanders radioed twice for ammunition and received silence, retreats that became routes when supply tails were cut, and pockets of resistance that lasted out of habit rather than hope. One significant scene took place in a ruined rail yard where a battalion waited for cold rations and instead found 3 empty trucks and a single sack of turnips. The conversation there between a company commander, Corporal Meyer, a sergeant named Keller, a supply clerk called Josef, and a young conscript named Emil comprised at least 6 exchanges that moved from confusion to anger to resignation. The tactile world told the story. The grit in mouths, the cold on palms holding helmets, the greasy smear of oil on a torn sleeve, the echo of boots on cracked concrete, the brief metallic taste of blood from a cut lip. The commander asked why the trucks were missing. The clerk said they were rerouted. The sergeant said they were requisitioned by the rear. The corporal said the rear had no right to take them. The conscript asked if he should surrender. The commander said to hold position until orders. That loop of small arguments mapped the larger failure. On the larger battlefield, the arithmetic failed catastrophically. Supply lines were overextended, convoys were interdicted, and stocks of fuel and ammunition were swallowed faster than factories could replenish them. Engineers like Adler could calculate gaps, but they could not make factories vaporize more steel. The sensory details of that winter played a role in morale. Snow ground into uniforms. The taste of black coffee warmed but did not restore. The sound of distant artillery became a clock of dread. The smell of burning timbers turned villages into memory, and the cold numbness in fingers slowed triggers and decisions. Inside the inner palace of power, a different drama unfolded, where concealment became policy.
There were memos that counseled euphemism, reports with redacted lines, and nightly gatherings where a performance of confidence was rehearsed. Dialogues inside those rooms often took the form of 6 to 8 back and forths between trusted lieutenants and ministers. Goebbels argued for tighter censorship and for an appearance of strength. Bormann suggested limiting access to certain archives. Keitel demanded that operational communications show unity. Speer offered technical solutions to create the impression of increased production even when outputs lagged. Adler confronted Speer in the workshop, and that exchange became a flashpoint. Speer said, numbers can be massaged in a report. Adler said, true numbers are visible on the platform. Speer replied, we must keep the nation oriented. Adler countered that orientation built on falsehood will end in catastrophe. Speer said the nation cannot face the truth now. Adler asked, who decides when people may be told? The debate carried the smoky taste of cigars and the cold sweat of men who felt culpable. Those who had access to the truth chose at first to obscure it, convinced that panic would be worse than deception. Some sought to protect the home front. Others sought to preserve their authority. The consequences were the same. Tension climbed at moments that deserve pause. Moment of tension 1. In a command bunker, the lights flickered as a map was redrawn. A clerk burst in with a stack of casualty lists that doubled what the ministry had published. The general who held the lamp gripped it like a talisman, and for the space of breaths, no one spoke. The air tasted metallic from the lamp fuel and from the blood on a bandaged hand. Voices lowered, then rose into accusation. A decision to delay publication was made in 2 sentences. That pause cost lives because families were kept in the dark and units in need were deprived of reinforcements. Moment of tension 2. A train carrying replacements derailed at night after a bridge had been bombed. Men huddled in snow and fought for blankets. The company commander argued with a railway official in a harsh exchange that ended when the commander struck the table. The smell of burning insulation and the scream of metal told him the war was moving past him into chaos. The strike cost the company the last of its dignity. Moment of tension 3. In a ministry office, a minister burned a file that contained letters from the front and reports from a trusted officer. The flames took the paper with a soft hiss. The minister looked at the ash and recited talking points that would be delivered on radio in morning news. The sound of paper and fire was loud enough to be remembered. Each of these moments slows the narrative and forces attention on the human experience of collapse rather than on abstract numbers. As the battles turned, the inner circle enacted maneuvers not on the map but on memory. Personal reputations were preserved through selective archives and through narratives fed to friendly newspapers. There were conspiracies of silence and a few conspiracies of action. People like Martin Bormann and Heinrich Himmler manipulated access and information. Some generals considered removing the leader once secrecy had failed. Names like Erich von Manstein, Wilhelm Keitel, Karl Donitz, and others crossed the pages of confidential notes and testimonies. There were whispered plans to negotiate separate surrenders and pockets, to bargain for stretches of territory, to create scapegoats. Dialogues in these rooms expanded into tactical plots of politics. In one extended exchange, Speer and Keitel argued for decentralizing decision-making to keep regions functional. Bormann opposed and insisted on strict control over announcements. Each voice sought to shape the aftermath and to ensure individual survival. The emotional texture of those hours was a mixture of perfumed offices, stale tobacco, the creamy taste of brandy swallowed hurriedly, the soft abrasion of velvet chairs under hands, and the low hum of generators keeping records steady. Those details matter because they show a regime trying to ordain its memory even as material reality disintegrated. The final collapse was both public and intimate. Cities fell in sequences that matched earlier censuses of denial. Soldiers surrendered not with banners but with empty pockets. Senior officers retreated to secure compounds and considered the language of capitulation. Friedrich Adler, who had kept his ledger, walked through rubble to find a school-turned-refugees camp. He spoke to a woman named Marta who had lost 2 sons. His exchange with her was simple and lasted 4 brief turns. He offered food. She asked how many more would die. He could not answer. The human toll was counted not in statistics but in names. When the leader finally withdrew from public view, the inner circle attempted at first to keep the narrative intact. They released statements that claimed orderly reorganization and floated ideas of heroic sacrifice. Yet on the ground, rescue efforts took shape in other ways. Local officials like Mayor Schmidt and an engineer named Lena worked to reopen rail spurs, to find water for hospitals, and to negotiate with advancing armies for ceasefires that would spare civilians. Those acts of solidarity contrasted with the earlier conspiratorial secrecy. 1 month later, the world had changed face. Factories stood idle, and the capital showed signs of hunger. Many names resurfaced in public hearings as people demanded accounts. Speer was stripped of influence, and Bormann vanished into secrecy. For civilians like Marta, there was relief coupled with grief. The epilogue first moment shows a city that attempted to resettle, with volunteers like Lena and Mayor Schmidt digging through rubble to create makeshift clinics. The soundscape shifted from sirens to the slow rumble of relief trains. The scent of baking bread returned in small neighborhoods where ovens still functioned. One bureaucrat who had altered reports was arrested and said before an inquiry, his hands stained with ash from documents he had burned. He whispered an apology that sounded like a confession to those who listened. The political balance changed as authority ebbed and new local leaders emerged to fill voids. That first month was a raw accounting of human needs and immediate attempts to patch what remained. 3 months after the fall, the legal and cultural reckoning intensified. Committees formed, testimonies were taken, and archives that had been hidden were pried open. Friedrich Adler testified in a hearing and presented his ledger. His backstory informs his testimony. Childhood poverty taught him the value of inventory and detail. Schooling in an engineering college taught him to trust measured observation. The loss of his brother in an earlier campaign had made him avoid rhetoric and prefer material truth. And his present identity as a logistics officer had turned him into a witness whose record could not be dismissed as partisan. That backstory shaped 3 short thematic memories. Childhood taught him resourcefulness and a distrust of easy answers. His formation as an engineer gave him tools to translate chaos into diagrams. A loss in his family hardened his insistence on clear accounting. Finally, his current work connected him to the soldiers and to the civilians who bore the consequences of command. Each paragraph of memory carried sensory anchors, like the smell of coal from his early years, the chalk dust of classrooms, the metallic echo of a rifle in a farewell, and the soft weight of a ledger in his hands. 3 months in the public eye, he found that some officials sought scapegoats and others sought reconciliation. Archives reopened, and the ledger became evidence in trials and in newspaper serials that shaped public memory. 6 months later, the longer legacy began to emerge. Memorials were erected in some towns, while in others silence persisted. Institutions were reformed on paper, and committees drafted new codes for supply and reporting. Yet the deeper lesson resisted tidy law. The epilogue, third moment, paints a landscape in which memory and accountability struggle. Some former officials faded into obscurity, and others rewrote their memories in memoirs that tried to transform culpability into misunderstanding. Speeches were given about rebuilding and about the need for transparency. A civic project led by Lena and Mayor Schmidt cataloged names of the missing and created community records so that families could claim what existed of their past. The texture of that later half-year included the smell of paper as archives were cataloged, the clean feeling of linen on newly made beds in refugee shelters, the metallic echo of gavels in tribunals, the taste of hot soup served in community kitchens, and the sight of trains hauled by engines repurposed to deliver relief rather than weapons. The moral we arrive at is stark. When those entrusted with information choose concealment, societies pay with human lives and with a slow corrosion of trust. The inner circle tried to hide a loss by shaping a narrative. They failed to contain the facts and failed in the attempt to contain the consequences. Responsibility returns in many small acts that rebuild community and in legal processes that attempt to untangle truth from performance.
When those who controlled the story refused to tell the truth, the only answer left to history was to count what remained and to name who had been lost.